are watching Channel Africa Conversations.
The idea was when the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, was established, its major task was, of course, unity, but the decolonization of Africa. And that's where most of its structures were geared towards the decolonization.
Hello and welcome to Channel Africa Conversations. I'm Peter Ndoro. There'll soon be a changing of the guard at the African Union Commission, with elections that are set for February 2025 during the 38th AU Summit in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Now, these elections will determine the leadership of the AU Commission, including the chairperson and the deputy chairperson positions. Under a reformed election process for the 2025 elections, the Eastern region will contest the role of chairperson and the Northern region will contest the role for deputy chairperson. Now, one person who understands these processes all too well and the workings of the African Union is former South African Cabinet Minister and former AU Commission Chair, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, who joins us today on Channel Africa Conversations. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and welcome.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, important elections coming up early next year. How important are these elections in terms of finding someone to take up these positions?
Well, they are very important because they are going to elect the entire commission. Of course, the chairperson is the head and the deputy, but the entire commission is going to be elected. And it's very important because that election means that person is going to be there for a minimum of 4 years. It could be 8 if they are re-elected. But also, that person has to drive the agenda of the AU in terms of ensuring that the policies are there, they evaluate the implementation, but also that person has to also interact with all the heads of state of the continent. So it is a very important election.
For the sake of our viewers, because I've often wondered how to explain what the AU Commission is like, and sometimes I try and think about it in terms of a company where maybe the heads of state are the board of directors and the commission and the commissioner are the executives that run the company, which is the commission itself. And I wonder if that is a fair analogy, because you're responsible for the day-to-day and making sure things happen. The board of directors meets periodically to get updates and share strategic ideas.
Well, if you compare it with business, yes, it would be a comparison.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And the UN Secretary General, is that similar as well?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay.
Yes.
So the question then becomes, how much influence does the AU Commission have in terms of how the Commission runs? Which is why this election, when we look at it, we consider how important it is.
It is very important because a lot of the policies that eventually get adopted originate from the Commission, but the Commission doesn't work alone. The Commission works with the permanent representatives who are the ambassadors to the AU who are based in Addis. So you work with them, and then in between you call the ministers as well. And the Council of Ministers is the foreign ministers. But there are also committees, which we call technical, which are committees that have formed by specific ministers, whether it's trade, whether it's women, whether it's agriculture. So there are lots of structures that inform what happens eventually at the AU before things get to the heads of state. They would have been processed through all those different structures.
55 members representing 1.5 billion people. AU Commission Chair must be one of the most difficult jobs that you've probably had in your career.
Strangely enough, no.
Really? Tell us what motivated you to want to take up this position.
Well, I'll be very honest. It wasn't initiated by me. It was initiated by SADC, who felt they wanted to field a candidate. And when the president came back from a SADC summit, I was called and I was told that that's what SADC thought, and they thought I could be the candidate. So I had to take it from there. Of course, I was anxious. One, because I was going to be competing against an incumbent, and I thought that was going to be difficult. But also, I was now coming from a national to a structure that is continental. But I must say, the SADC ministers did a lot of work. As you'll remember, I lost. I didn't win. I didn't lose.
Yes.
We both didn't win.
Yeah.
Because to win, you have to get 2/3. So neither of us got 2/3 in the first election. And then a couple of months later, they reconvened. And that's when I got the 2/3.
So I want to talk a little bit about that, because I think that contributed to the reform that we're now seeing in the electoral process, the rotation, regional representation, and also I think gender parity. That was something that you championed quite a bit during your tenure. Let's talk about that election process, because in the end it sounded as if, from us outside looking in, that the divisions were not so much about merit, but more about things like language and region. Is that something that the AU has had to grapple with in its existence?
Well, yes, it's always grappled with, because, I mean, the AU is not a new organization. It comes from the Organization of African Unity. Even with documents, sometimes you spend time arguing about language, that the English version and the French version or the Arabic version. So language does play a role in the running of the commission, but I suppose language informs attitude as well. But I think it's getting less and less of an influence in the AU. I wouldn't say it's a major issue, no, it's not. Gender, when I was foreign minister and we were moving from the OAU to the AU, that's when we said at least there must be parity. There must be an equal number of commissioners, male and female. But at the time, it didn't translate to the chair and the deputy chair. So since the AU started, the commissioners have always been equal. But then we had both chair and deputy being male. So when I was there, that's one of the things we thought, that there must be parity up to the chair. If the chair is a male, the deputy must be female, or vice versa. So that reform eventually came through.
All right, we'll talk a little bit more about your work and the functioning of the AU, but let's begin maybe with the switch between the OAU to the AU. There was a shift in thinking and requirement of this Pan-African body. Take us to that historic moment in Durban. I think President Mbeki was the host president at the time. What was the idea that was coming into being about what the African Union was going to do and look like?
Well, I think it didn't, in Durban, it was
Yeah.
the launch.
Yes.
That the work was done.
Right.
The work started in 1999 in Libya at CERT.
Right.
That's when a discussion were happening. I remember one evening the discussions went beyond midnight.
Wow.
But the idea was when the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, was established, its major task was, of course, unity, but the decolonization of Africa. And that's where most of its structures were geared towards the decolonization. And they had decided in 1945, before the OAU was established at the Pan-African Congress, that Africa must be decolonized within 50 years. Other than Western Sahara, it was decolonized within 50 years. South Africa was decolonized on the 49th year.
Wow.
So then the discussion was, yes, now that has been almost achieved. What is the next focus? The next focus, yes, we were decolonized, but our economies are not decolonized. They need to be transformed. The education infrastructure is not connecting us because each colony was looking, the colonizer was looking at taking things to the sea and not connecting with other countries on the continent because there was no real desire to trade within the continent. So there had to be a shift, and that's what the discussions were about, but also that we must not lose sight of the fact that this organization is supposed to integrate Africa, it's supposed to unite Africa, and it's supposed to keep Africa developed, prosperous. That's why if you look at the statement about the AU, it said we want an integrated, prosperous, peaceful continent driven by its people and playing a dynamic role in the global arena. Because the shift was now towards integration, towards prosperity of the continent and its people.
Do you think that the AU has been able to move towards that over time?
Well, it's a process. Of course, it's not something that can happen overnight. Even here in South Africa, we haven't reached destination. But I think the thinking has changed. The thinking now is, if you look at the agenda that is now the agenda of the continent, unfortunately, I'll call it Agenda 2063. If you look at Agenda 2063, it's looking, first before I look at what it says, we worked together with the Africa Development Bank and with ECA, the three of us worked together to see how, because the development bank has to look at the financing. So its own priorities must also speak to the priorities of the continent. So if you look at their priorities, they decided on what they called the high five. The high five is about lighting up, powering Africa, feeding Africa, integrating Africa, which means also infrastructure development, but also the well-being of its people, which means education and health. So it connects with what the AU wants to do. The AU wants eventually to have a continent that is industrialized, that is developed, whose people, whose livelihoods are of a high standard. And so that's what the AU wants. That's why it talks about also a skills revolution, because it recognizes that the economies of today and tomorrow need skilled people. And the majority of the people on this continent are young people. So we need to skill them, not only to be job seekers, but to be job creators, to be innovators, researchers. And that skills revolution has to be underpinned by science, technology, innovation, engineering, and so on. It also says it looks at connecting the continent. You should be able to drive from here to Tanzania or Cairo if you so wish. You should be able to take rail to Senegal and wherever. You should be able to take a boat to take you to Kenya, or, you know. So infrastructure, both road, rail, air, and sea, must be developed to connect us, connect our capitals, connect our cities. But it also looks at how do we industrialize. You must have power. And obviously power means, in today's language, it must also be clean. So that's why there's a big issue around Inga, because Inga can generate electricity that will supply beyond the Congo itself. It can supply other countries. Well, we have more than 300 days of sunshine, so we should be able to use that resource. We also looking at, of course, energy is needed for manufacturing. What do we manufacture? You manufacture mainly around things you have. One, we have natural resources. We must be able to add value, beneficiate, and sell and trade amongst ourselves and the globe, but trading in finished goods. We have all the minerals that the world needs. You name it, you find it on the continent. We should be able to beneficiate and not send those minerals raw, because when you send them raw, sometimes you can't afford them when they've been beneficiated. And also it means you are sending jobs that should be beneficiating. You are sending revenue that you get when you have finished goods. So that's a major priority for the AU and the continent. Also, the ocean. We have neglected the economy on the ocean. We have how many seas? We have 5 seas as a continent. We have the Atlantic, we have the Indian, we have the Red, the Mediterranean, the Antarctic. But if you were to look at the vessels that are on the high seas, none of them are ours. You look at the fishing boats, big fishing boats, hardly any of them are ours. If you look at people inside those boats, they are hardly Africans. But 90% of goods that come into the continent come through the maritime highways. The exports that leave the continent, 90% go through the maritime highways, but we are not in those highways. And in the economy there, it's not just the vessel, it's the things that are used inside the vessels, it's the insurance, it's the logistics that bring things up and down. It's a huge economy. And now there's even deep sea mining, there's oil. If you look at Norway, for instance, Norway's economy is mainly based on the sea since the time of the Vikings. So we have a huge potential that we haven't tapped.
All right, so the future is there. 2063, Agenda 2063. I know that was a a pivotal and passionate project for you personally. And I wonder if you weren't even inspired by the Freedom Charter and making sure that everybody was involved and that it's something that could belong to all Africans.
Of course, your previous experience
Yeah.
informs your thinking. And that's why, for instance, when we were developing the Agenda 2063, we didn't sit in Addis and write it. We had consultations with different sectors: youth, women, workers, scientists, academia, artists, you name them, religious leaders, so that we could get their views. What do they think this continent should look like in 50 years or even before? And that consultation then assisted us to then sit and say, okay, this is what the Africans want. Let's put it into a document. But what inspired us to look 50 years was we were celebrating 50 years of the OAU. And I said, let's look at what it has done. Let's look at what they decided, the decolonization and everything. What are we deciding for the next 50 years? There was a bit of resistance at the beginning because they were saying, oh, they are used to just doing a 4-year strategic plan. So I was saying, no, let's look at what we want people to celebrate in 50 years.
Right.
But eventually, it was accepted, especially when I did that letter to Kwame. And when it was read, then the minister said, no, now we understand what it's about. But it also says that this Africa must be driven by its people, mainly women and youth, not excluding men. Men have always been there. So we're now bringing women and youth to be the drivers of this continent. In every area of human endeavor, there should be men and women, there should be young and old, working intergenerational teams working together.
So I'm going to put on my African citizen hat, and a lot of people, I don't know whether it's understanding, misunderstanding, not understanding. I'm sitting in Darfur right now, and I've just watched a neighbor raped by the RSF, and I am thinking somebody should be there to protect me.
Yes.
And I should be thinking about the African Union. What do we tell that person in Sudan?
Yes. I think if you look at the issue of peace in the world, the primary responsibility lies with the Security Council, right? But because the Security Council has not always been responsive, the AU then decided to have peace and security architect. That's why we have countries that are elected to sit in the peace and security, and they then look at what is going on and see what can be done. Of course, the challenge is one, the funding, also when troops are needed, whether countries can afford to send troops. But we mustn't forget that the primary responsibility is the Security Council. And that's why we also want the Security Council to be reformed, because it hasn't lived up to what it's supposed to do. But the AU, at different times, when I was there, it worked with the UN. There were troops in Darfur. even before I was there, during the time I was foreign minister, because there was a problem there long before now in Darfur. So the AU, together with the Security Council, Kofi Annan was still there. I remember him coming to Addis to discuss what can be done together. So I think we were in Angola as women not so long ago, invited by the president of Angola to discuss the issue of the DRC, for instance. And our view was the negotiations must also have women in them. Conflict resolution, women must also be involved. Women are the people who get affected most when there's a conflict. But when there's resolution of that conflict, there are no women. So no, and that's why when I got to Addis, I established a special envoy for peace and women, peace and security, who then go out to see what help can be brought for women in those situations. Well, as I say, the major problem is usually the funding, but that peace and security envoy is the one also who had organized, together with Angola, that meeting that we were attending. So there are efforts. They are not sufficient, clearly, but the Security Council is not playing its role.
So part of it is capacity, but there are some things that can be done. For example, if an election has obviously been stolen by an authority, the African Union surely can then say, you can't sit at our table for as long as you have stolen an election in your own country. There seems to be a difficulty sometimes. I don't know whether it is this protection of each other's sovereignty that seems to be the most prominent view, that yes, we're a gathering, however, we don't interfere in each other's countries when the citizens in those countries actually want you to interfere.
Well, they do. The AU does work sometimes with the UN, sometimes alone. If you look at, I'm not saying anyone stole the elections, but there was a problem in Kenya in 2007, around there, I think. There was intervention there,
Right.
and that resulted in a government that was acceptable to all. Even in Zimbabwe at some stage, if you remember, there was a government that involved...
National Unity, 2008.
Yes. So it's not quite true that nothing ever happens.
We've got 3 military juntas right now in West Africa, coup d'etats that are in play. It can't be that we have to rely just on the Peace and Security Council at the United Nations. Is there nothing we can do as a community of 52 other states to say to these 3, this is unacceptable?
Well, first and foremost, it has to be unacceptable to the people on the ground. Is it? That's where it must start. I'm not saying there are efforts, but I'm saying it has to be first unacceptable on the ground. If people on the ground are welcoming it, it becomes difficult, because then it means we are going to be fighting with people on the ground rather than talking to the person who's leading. I don't know whether you understand what I'm saying.
I hear what you're saying.
So it makes it difficult when the people on the ground because that person may be doing things that the people on the ground appreciate.
Right. So it's
You
not
see?
always clear cut.
Yes.
Okay.
It's not
So
always.
going forward, 2063 is around the corner actually, and it's coming fast and furious. Do you think we'll make it?
Yeah, there are things that will be achieved. As a start, I'm sure we would have achieved the continental free trade. We're almost there. So, yes, there are things that will be achieved. There may be things that will not be achieved. The continental free trade is important in the sense that it will facilitate other things. For instance, if we have to trade amongst ourselves, we must industrialize. So it will accelerate the industrialization, hopefully. And if we are to trade amongst ourselves, the goods must move and the people must move. So it will accelerate the free movement of goods and people. And if we have a continental free trade, that's a way towards integration. So I'm just using that as an example, that I don't think we should be thinking nothing will happen. It's happening.
Yeah. Progress is
being made. Maybe not fast enough, but it is being made.
If we go back to the beginning and even the transition, there's one word that keeps coming up: Organization of African Unity,
Yes.
the African Union. So my question to you is, are we getting to a point where, as Africans across the continent, we feel that unity, that we are unified as Africans?
Not to the extent we should. But let's take a concrete example. There was Ebola in 3 countries. And when we were at the UN, President Obama said, if nothing is done, 1.4 million Africans are going to die, right? We came back, the business people and ourselves came together and said, what are we going to do ourselves as Africans? Then we said business were ready to collect money to assist. We then called for volunteers. We got some volunteers. Then we called a special meeting of foreign ministers and we said, we need countries to send health workers. We will take care of them when they are there as the AU, but you take care of their salaries at home. And fair enough, we got more than 800 health workers who went to these 3 countries. And we interviewed some of them. They were mostly young ones. I remember one young worker from Kenya. He said, well, I sat and thought, what if this was happening in Kenya and nobody came? So I must go. Another one from another country said, we've always talked about Pan-Africanism. We thought this was giving us a chance to show it in practice. And that's what drove me to volunteer. And indeed, it helped. Countries contributed. We hardly had assistance from outside, I must tell you. The countries that assisted us was Cuba. They sent about 200 of their health workers. A little bit Chinese also sent. But on the whole, we didn't get.
We had to fend for ourselves.
The Americans did build the health facilities, the temporary health facilities, but no humans. We looked after them whilst they are there, accommodation, transport, food, everything. And what was pleasing is that whereas they had said 1.4 million people are going to die, not even 100,000. Here in South Africa during COVID, we lost more than 100,000, but we didn't lose 100,000. We lost less than that because of the unity of Africans at a political and at a business level and at a ground level, because the people who volunteered were people on the ground.
Right.
So that's a good example to show that we may not be doing it to the same extent, but that crisis showed that
We have the capacity.
we have the capacity, we have the feeling that our
We just
neighbor
need
is
to
in
nurture
trouble.
it more and more.
Yes.
Okay, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but I do want, as a final question, to take you back where we started and this upcoming election for the new AU Commission chair. If you had to sit alone in the office with the next Commission chair and give that chair advice, what would you say to that person in terms of, this is what I think you really should work on, that we critically need to do?
Well, I think the policies are there. Even before I came, there were lots of policies that were in place. They'd even selected champions from different countries, champion for trade, champion for infrastructure. Champion for infrastructure is supposed to be South Africa. And many champion for climate change, champion for this and that. So the policies, I would say, are there. What needs to be done, concentrated on, is the implementation. But before I left Addis, we were trying to get countries to integrate Agenda 2063 into their national plans. Because at the end of the day, who should implement? It's the countries. So we were trying to assist. Some of the countries asked us to send teams to work with them. And I think that should be the case. Countries must integrate issues of Agenda 2063 into their national plans. The policies are there, it's the implementation. We need the capacity to implement, we need the political will to implement. And so I think his work would be to really work with countries, heads of states, but also the different technical committees, the Pan-African Parliament. The Pan-African Parliament is a very important structure of the AU. And it should be also ensuring that countries do implement, because the Pan-African Parliament consists of parliamentarians from different countries. So they should be able to take the African agenda into their parliaments and into
Real
the
life.
ground.
Yeah.
And it's one structure that actually must link the AU to the ground, Pan-African Parliament. There is also what we call ECOSOC, which is a structure that is supposed to link up with non-governmental organizations across the continent to also do the same thing. We also link with the diaspora, because if you are in the diaspora, you will only be respected according to how much Africa is respected. And I think it's important to work with the diaspora, both to develop the continent, but also to ensure that we also link with them and we're part of what they experience. Ghana, I think, is leading us on this. Ghana, though they are working mainly with the diaspora in the US, any Black American can get Ghanaian citizenship now.
Oh.
Yes. And during the time I was foreign minister there, the idea from the heads of state was that people in the diaspora should be allowed to come back to any country, not necessarily to the country of their origin, to any country where they think their expertise can be utilized. And they can help us to start centers of excellence in different sectors. And there could be a center of excellence on something in South Africa, another center of excellence on something different in another country, and so on. So these are some of the programs that are not just at the AU, but that link with the ground.
So bottom line, the plans are there already.
Yes.
Just actualize them.
That's my view.
Okay.
Yes.
Dr. Dlamini-Zuma, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for giving us your time.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The only thing that I think we should also talk about a bit is to just wish our sister in Namibia.
Oh, yes.
It's election day today in Namibia.
Right.
And for the first time in Southern Africa, we have a woman candidate.
Right.
And that should be something we celebrate, and that should be something that we pray, we wish, we talk to our ancestors to ensure she wins. She will be if she wins, and I think she will, at least.
Yeah.
She will be the second African woman to run for a presidential election.
Right.
Isn't that something?
It is significant.
It's
something
significant.
that should actually be commonplace. But we'll certainly be watching that. But thank you so much indeed for your insights, your thoughts, and your reflections.
Thank you.
And that's how we come to the end of today's edition of Channel Africa Conversations. Thank you so much indeed for tuning in. Let's do it again next time. But before I go, don't forget, please engage with us on our social media platforms on your screen now. We'd love to know what you'd like to talk about, who you'd like us to talk to, and hopefully we'll be able to bring those programs for you in the future. From me and the team, see you next time.